All yours, Mac. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, welcome everybody to today's webinar on where we can get help. Thank you so much for joining. We might wait a few more moments to let everyone else join into the Zoom, but we will get started very shortly. Awesome. Well, I might make a start, and anyone else who is joining in a little bit late won't be missing out too much. But before we begin, I'd like to introduce myself. Hi, my name is Mac. I will be one of the facilitators for today's webinar. I use he, him pronouns, and today I am joining you all from the lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. So a quick visual description of me is that I have, oh, well, you can't tell the color. I don't even know what color it is today. But I have dyed short curly hair that is currently a washed out purple color. I'm wearing a mustard beanie. I have a black hoodie on. I have olive skin. My background is that of a black chalkboard wall with scribbles all over it from exams last year. I also have a feeding tube that you can see on my cheek, which has fun little icy pole tubey tape on it. So I'm really excited to be your guide for today's webinar and helping to facilitate these really awesome discussions on inclusion in early education. So before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that even though we're all meeting virtually and all on different lands, I, like said in my introduction, I am calling in from the lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, but we would like to acknowledge all of the lands and acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands in which we all work, live and play, and pay deep respects to elders both past and present, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Would also like to say that there is no justice without First Nations justice, especially when we are talking about inclusive education. There are additional barriers that First Nations young people have towards accessing education, and inclusive education is also inclusive education for that of First Nations people. Would also really encourage everyone who is watching today's session to pop in the chat where they're calling in from. And there's also more information in the chat. So for today's webinar, we'll be recapping what is meant by inclusion and what is needed to balance building your mindset and skill set. Then there'll be tips on information, supports, and funding, which will then go into a nice 5-minute little break. And then when we come back together, we'll talk about some other things to consider and have some final reflections before we wrap up for today's webinar. So CYDA believes hearing directly from young people with disabilities about their experiences helps families, caregivers, and communities to have high expectations and aspirations for all children. That's why we ask today that we're all respectful to one another and are inclusive. Sometimes in talking about our experiences, we might cover questions or a topic that is sensitive or also includes some things that are a bit tough to hear. Which is why during this and other webinars, we'll use a term called content notes, which involves us warning you that something we're going to talk about, say something around ableism, for example, or discrimination. It gives you an option to opt in or out of that conversation. And later on, say when we're having those questions posed, some of the CYDA team might step in because we might not feel comfortable answering that question. And this is not canceling the question or shutting down the conversation. We really want these conversations to happen, but we just want to make sure that everyone's needs are met and they're able to engage in a way that is comfortable for them, which also includes us as facilitators and story sharers. Just a reminder that throughout this webinar, If something is brought up that makes you feel difficult or uncomfortable for you, please reach out for support. You can access it by heading to www.cyda.org.au, and these details will be pasted in the chat for support. So they're also on the screen if you want to take a photo on your phone or whatever you need to make sure you have access to this if you do need support after this training. Before we get into it, we would like each of the panelists to introduce themselves so you can get to know us. Today we have myself, so Mac, Ashley and Will, we're the young people for today's session. We also have Sue, Daniel and Ewan. I will now ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves and also share a headline of their favorite childhood memory. So we're going to introduce our names, our organization or title, our pronouns, the lands we're calling in from, a visual description, and for a fun one, a favorite childhood memory. I'll pass to Will to go first.
Hi everyone, my name's Will. I use he and him pronouns. My favourite childhood memory would be meeting Shazza from Housos at the Sydney Children's Hospital, where she works as a Starlight Express children's entertainer. And I'll hand you over to Ashley.
Hi, so my name's Ashley. I use she, her pronouns. I come from Ngunnawal land, so South Canberra. A visual description about me. I have, I guess you could say, dark blonde hair, green eyes, pale skin, and I am wearing large black squared Ray-Ban glasses. Favorite childhood memory, I guess, would have to be my first concert, maybe.
Sue speaking. Thanks, Ashley. And we'll ask you to put in the chat, what was that concert? What was your first concert? Because I'd be keen to know what it was. So my name is Sue Tape. I work for CYDA in our policy and research team. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm joining from the lands of the Yugara and the Turrbal people up here in Brisbane. And a visual description of me, I am a slightly older woman, so late 40s. I have dark, short, curly hair. I wear black glasses, and I'm definitely got pale, moon pale skin. And behind me, you might be able to see in my background or not, a whole lot of Lego constructions. So very excited to be part of the webinar today, and I will hand over to Daniel from our team as well to introduce himself.
G'day folks, Daniel speaking. My name is Daniel. I'm from CYDA. I'm the Youth Programs Manager at CYDA. Quick image description of myself is that I have short, dark hair. I wear dark glasses and I have a very seedy mustache. I'm dressed up in quite formal wear today as I have a meeting at the Parliament House in Melbourne. And my favorite childhood memory, I guess similar to Ashley, going to a concert, although I know for sure that concert was the Wiggles. And I know for sure that I was dressed up as Dorothy the dinosaur. And I know that I got a shout out from Greg the yellow Wiggle. Oh, sorry, no, the purple Wiggle, sorry. But that's, my Wiggles knowledge has deteriorated over time. I'll throw it over to Ewan.
Thanks, Daniel. Hi, everyone. I'm Ewan. I'm the Policy Engagement Officer here at CYDA. I'm calling from Wurundjeri land in Melbourne. For a visual description, I have short brown hair, an orange-brown beard, and I'm wearing a red and pink top. And favorite childhood memory, getting to ride in the Batmobile in the movie world, like parade. That was pretty cool. And I'll pass back to, am I passing back to you, Sue?
Back to Mac. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you everyone for those introductions. We just have some housekeeping before we begin. This webinar does have Auslan interpreters, which you'll be able to see on the screen alongside the speakers. This session, we do have live captions and they will be visible at the bottom of your screen. And if you can't see them, you can click on the CC button at the bottom of the screen and you can turn on your captions on. And if they're on and you want them off, you can turn them off. Please use the Q&A function. If you do have any questions, feel free to type questions. We love questions. And this session will also be recorded. So for those who couldn't make today's session, still have access to the webinars. And if you do have any technical issues throughout today's webinar, please private message our webinar support person, Daniel or Ewan, in the chat, who are able to help you out. So the first 3 webinars in this series of 6 topics covered things such as inclusion, identity, language, and where to start with inclusion in early education. We also looked at the role we also looked at the role that early prevention in early childhood and tips on where to start. Later on in the webinar, we are building on these ideas and kind of growing from there with the guide of young people. And we want to look at what does all of this have to do in regards to school and education. We are now going to move on to part 1 and start with an overview of information, supports, and funding, and then recap on what is meant by inclusion to help build your mindset and skill sets. So in this webinar, we're going to explore 3 main topics: information, supports, and funding. Along with our insights from our experiences in childhood, we will explore what topics of information may be useful. We will share trusted resources and how to effectively use that information. When we move on talking about supports, we will cover how knowing what is the purpose of these supports is critical. We will also talk about the people that you can find that's important to support your family and friends. We're also going to cover what adjustments you might find most helpful, how being included within adjustments are a critical part of childhood, and how those arrangements may be made. Then at the end, we're finally going to talk about funding and how families might go about identifying what funding might be used for, where it could come from, what paperwork might be necessary, and who can assist with this process. Even as a young child in play-based settings, there are components to inclusion that are critical for participating and learning. These are things such as physical inclusion, so present and fully participating in the same learning environment that is accessible for all children for the same amount of time. Social inclusion, socially, all children are welcomed, supported to belong, and not separated from their peers on the basis of their disabilities or differences. And curriculum inclusion. This is when curriculum is delivered accessibly and all children are included in the same learning material with appropriate adjustments made. Next, we want to return to the idea of finding a balance in your role. So for families, it is the balance between mindset and skill set for inclusion. And I will pass to Sue.
Thanks, Mac. This is something that we talked about in some previous webinars, so balancing your mindset and your skill set for inclusion. And in particular, in this session, we're focusing on the orange area of the slide that's indicated by an arrow, and the text reads, access to and use of technology for gathering, filtering, and digesting information. So in plain language, how on earth does a young person with disability or a family member of a young person with disability, whether it be a young child, get through all the information that is out there? How do they find, filter, and work out which bits to use, how to use it, and what sources can be trusted as well? So that really is the focus of today. And we introduced this idea, or this balancing act, in webinar 3, if you wanted to go back and check that out. So there are lots of different things under mindset, including having a vision for your child or for the childhood, using a strengths-based approach, and families needing to set boundaries so that your child is more than their disability or their diagnosis. And this is where bringing in and building family support and allies to support gives you space and time to focus on that. Now, understandably, and obviously it's a busy diagram, a busy screen, and the whole process or the whole experience may feel like a lot, and that building your skill set is just as important. So this includes advocating for your child in a way that creates positive and affirming experiences for them, and also builds a community around that child and the family. Families also talk about how they look at what works and what doesn't work. So this means evaluating, regrouping, capitalizing, and also celebrating the hard work and the success. But as I said, this webinar focuses on the area in orange, so building the skills to access and use technology for gathering, filtering, and digesting that information. So we're going to move on to talking about challenges. And there's a lot of discussion, and I will hand back to Mac in a minute. There's a lot of discussion about the challenges. Today's webinar is really focused on linking the solutions to those challenges back to what's best for the child and the family. So we are very aware of the challenges that are often created by systems and paperwork. Many articles have been written in recent times around things like the NDIS, and then also the lack of supports outside the NDIS. So while today we won't necessarily be talking about the system and what we would like to see changed, we do want to acknowledge that there are challenges in navigating these processes, whether it be within the NDIS system or otherwise. So I suppose if you could stay focused on these three young people who are going to share their wealth of knowledge and their experience, that would be awesome. So Mac, I'll hand back to you.
So we want to acknowledge that there are challenges to consider when navigating information, organizing supports, and funding. Some of these will be covered throughout today's webinar through our stories and insights, but we also want to look at them overall first. So information, there are lots of information and influences out there, which means that it can get quite overwhelming and at times have various inputs that might say different things to help navigate early years. But accessing information in 2022 means that children and family need access to reliable and affordable technology. So shifting and sorting and working out what to do with this information takes a lot of time. And for families, we know that number one on their wish list is targeted information for their children, their needs, and their community. And searching for an answer to diagnosis and defining disability often tends to drive conversations and choices, which is not necessarily aligning with like the natural rhythms and activities of childhood. So it is a really delicate tension between time, energy, and effectiveness that is a huge balancing act. So for supports, naturally, if someone offers to support or direct families of young children, we'll look at them as a trusted source and welcome places and reliable people to help achieve those outcomes and goals. Families will look for people to guide them and provide supports to help them. And families, you may often be offered special programs or services, which may be really helpful, but it's also really important to note that this might mean that your child misses out or has less time for typical childhood experiences. Families, you have to make the decisions every day about juggling priorities, family needs, and circumstances. And this warm welcome and feeling they need to take up special options does impact the parent's natural authority or approach to make decisions. In funding, we really want to encourage families to look for supports and funding that align to their vision for their children and family. And again, please avoid risk of only focusing on the child's diagnosis, which does mean that things can involve some hard work emotionally, physically, and socially, but it is worth it.
Thank you, Mac. What we're going to do now is move on to the core part of our webinar today, which is to hear from our young people around their tips, their tricks, and their experiences. So the first area we're going to focus on is information. So I've asked the three young people, so Mac, Will, and Ashley today, to pull together some stories and some insights. And so the first area is around information. I'll get Daniel to go down to that slide for me. So the sorts of things we're going to be looking at is what topics of information are useful, and also, excuse me, the trusted sources. So there's a lot of misinformation out there at times, particularly if someone is trying to sell you something at the same time as they're providing you with information. And we're also going to talk about how to effectively use that information. So just while we're listening to the young people, and I'm going to call on Will first, I'll ask Daniel to stop sharing the slides so that we can see people's faces as we're talking. That would be great. So Will, I'm going to hand over to you. And I suppose if you can share your insights that you've pulled together around information and the advice that you would give to families, please.
Sure. Okay, so I want to take you guys back to where I was young. I'm 20 now, so it's been like lots of years since this happened. So I was diagnosed, but they wouldn't diagnose me. They didn't want to put a label on me yet until 2 years old. But they knew something was wrong. But my parents knew that there was something wrong. Just 1 second while to shush. Sorry about that. They're just annoying me. So doctors wouldn't diagnose me with all of my diagnoses that I have now. Just gathering my notes. Treatment was only given when problems arose. I was failing to thrive. I had sucking problems, so I was sent to a speech pathologist at the hospital for free back then. No assessments were given for a holistic treatment plan. And that they knew something was up, but they didn't want to give me a label because they didn't feel like for me to be on the label, if that makes sense to everyone. And
it does. Will, can I ask you a question about it?
Sure.
So as a young person now, and you reflect on that, what information do you wish that your family had at that time?
Support services, where to find them. Back then, the NDIS was nothing. The NDIS wasn't there at all. The NDIS actually came out when I was 16. So I think it really needed to be there since the day one of my life journey, because, yeah.
Okay. Is there anything else that you wanted to say about using information or sources of information that would be helpful?
Ooh, that's a hard one.
Well, shall I move on to Ashley, and maybe we can come back?
Yeah, if that's, yeah.
Okay, thanks, Will. Ashley?
Yeah, so for those who joined late, hi, I'm Ashley. Bit of a background around my disability. I was diagnosed in 2005 with Asperger's syndrome, which would now be classified as somewhere on the autism spectrum. I need my notes because I've just blinked. The biggest thing I kind of wish, looking back at it now, as a 22-year-old, one thing I really wish my parents had an understanding of was the child's disability just doesn't stop at something like autism or something like that. There can be a lot of other what's referred to as comorbidities that the child can have that can also affect their learning. So, for example, in my early years of primary school, I had trouble writing. I have poor fine motor skills. I had trouble reading. When it came to my spelling, I would always get it close, but I would have letters backwards, or I would have letters not quite in the right formation. And a lot of people just considered that to be back then as, oh, she's just not great at spelling. Oh, she's just not great at writing or whatever. Fast forward to when I was about, I know this is a early childhood years, but when I was 10 years old, they figured out that I did not know my sounds. And so then back to the pediatrician we went, and turns out I was also dyslexic and also ADHD. So my biggest thing I really want to emphasize with parents is do that further research. If your child is having issues in literacy, numeracy, all that kind of stuff, chances are, as they have a disability, there is also probably something lingering under that disability that could cause that issue. So that's my biggest kind of thing I would like to push out there. I did write some things around information, because as an autistic person, I am aware of the good old potions and stuff they like to try and sell people. So one thing I really wish my parents had back in the day as a 22-year-old, my parents didn't really have social media and in proper internet access and all that kind of stuff. It was only really coming in when I was about 11 or 12, and by then it wasn't really needed for my parents. But I know, and this is pretty obvious to anyone, and as Sue mentioned before, it's very hard to find a good resource, and it's very hard to find a good community, which I think, and as was explained before, it's all really about finding a good, strong community for you and your child as well. So what I have done is, okay, awesome. Sue's already posted it for me. I have put together a list of resources that I strongly recommend that people try and have a look at to try and get some support for their child's disability. I just want to mention I'm not affiliated with any of these groups, and I have also tried to, as I'm aware not everyone here would have a child that's neurodiverse and or autistic, I have tried to put in some general disability stuff in there. So yeah, that's all I have to say.
That's okay. Thanks, Ashley. I think as we have the opportunity, if that's okay, I wanted to ask you to explain, as a person who identifies as neurodiverse, what does that mean to you? Because there are a lot of words that families might be seeing, and if they don't necessarily,
yes,
there might be new words to them.
Of course, my apologies.
No,
so the easiest way I explain neurodiverse and neurodivergent to parents and other people is just basically my brain's wired differently. And it just basically means I think a little bit differently and I do things a little bit differently. And it just so happens that the way I think and do things differently has a label attached to it, such as autism, ADHD, dyspraxia. I think that's neurodiverse, but yeah, anyway, that's how I tend to explain it.
And one of the things that you talked about was also around needing to sort of go back to where some of your learning challenges were coming from and identifying that you were dyslexic as well. So I know that you have professional experience that's relevant here. So I'm interested, what advice would you give to families about sources of information? So I'm not saying to diagnose themselves, but to try and understand what might be typical, what might be different, and then how they can sort of go to people and say, I'm noticing these differences.
Yeah, sure. What Sue was referring to there for everyone here, I'm actually a primary school teacher's aide and I do work in the early childhood years. So my biggest thing is checking with the teacher. I think that's the main one, in terms of just asking them, how is my child going with their reading? Are you noticing anything strange? If you're lucky to have a TA with your child at an early age as well, checking in with them, because we do a lot of literacy support with kids. I think as well as a lot of this information, yes, sorry, I will try and not use abbreviations and all that kind of stuff. My apologies. My biggest thing, where was I? Reports, yes. I think as well, when you get your child's report, again, mainly in primary school, but and you see comments like what my parents were getting told when it comes to spelling and all these kinds of things, where she's not getting the letters quite right, she's so close, she just needs to improve, all that kind of stuff. I think it's important to then kind of go to the teacher, executive support, whoever, and say, hey, you are telling me this. Can you provide some insight as to why they are doing this? Again, depending on how good your system is, I would be asking, how are you doing to help support this? And do you think this is a reason for concern as to if it's dyslexia or something else?
Thank you, Ashley. Mac, I'm going to hand over to you. So we're still focusing on information, topics that are useful, sources that we trust, and effective use of the information. What would you like to share with people?
Yeah, I think for me, I was really lucky. My mum is in the healthcare field. So all that jargonistic information and reports and research and all those articles that are typically made for medical professionals and not for families, she was able to understand, which I think was really helpful because a lot of families might hear about cures or treatments that are not backed in any evidence. But because my mom was able to have a comprehension of this information that most people don't have, it was really helpful to know like what is actually appropriate and what not is, because lots of people are trying to sell stuff to get money and off vulnerable families with young kids with disabilities. So I think that's something I really appreciated, but obviously that's not really an option for most people. So I found something that's kind of a compromise of getting information is kind of like a balance. Medical professionals are great to have information, but if you're like me and have some diagnoses that are a lot more rarer, most doctors can't really help with that. And the specialists are great, but if it's underfunded and under researched, there might not actually be that information specialists can give. And then families can be really great because they get it and they're able to provide information on a personal level that medical professionals just don't have that lived experience for. And so I think it's about finding a balance between the two, because both have issues. But I think as well, something I kind of say we should be more focusing on is trying to get information directly from community. So it's really awesome to get information from other parents. Maybe that's more applicable if you're trying to get experience as a parent, trying to support a kid as a parent, and get that way, but also looking at asking adults with that exact same diagnosis and getting advice from them around information, because they're the ones who have that experience. They exist with that diagnosis and it's their world and they have a lot of answers. There are so many awesome people on social media that share information. So I find they're a really great source to get information from, because that's their lives, and there are so many people out there who are willing to share. So I definitely think having a look at them, but I think the most effective use is trying to find a balance. And if something a medical professional says that rubs you off the wrong way, try a different one. So I really think it's about using them all together and getting the information that everyone's saying and kind of merging it into one and going with that is probably my best advice.
Thank you, Mac. I think as someone who sorry, I'm trying to think of a polite way to say this. So everyone on the screen currently, the internet was alive when they were born. So it's a slightly different approach, maybe for some parents, some professionals, some families, in that the internet and digital sources, there are so many of them. And I suppose, Mac, what I'm hearing from you, and I know, Ashley, you put this in your advice as well, is Facebook groups or sources of information that are run by people with disability themselves, and who identify and are willing to obviously share parts of their experience. Those are things that previously people wouldn't have had access to, but it's, as you said, Mac, it's a great opportunity to hear direct from people. I suppose one of the things that is the advantage of this webinar is that we can ask you directly about your childhood. Do you find, and Ashley, I'll ask you this about your groups that you follow, do you find that people can reflect back on their childhood and share insights about what families could learn, or are we rare in asking these questions about looking back at your childhood?
I think it's a bit of both. We definitely have, like, I remember when the first call out was done for videos in regards like experiences of early childhood experiences, and I had a list of stuff I could remember. So it does. Obviously, as you get older, there's probably less to be able to remember, but we can. Are we often asked? Not really. I find when conversations are focused on the younger years, so say in teenagehood, I think we do a better job asking adults and teenagers for their experiences, but with the younger years, I often find, and it's not just disability specific, I think it's as a whole, often the opportunity to share and speak are given to the parents of those kids. And while I mean, I guess a 1-year-old probably can't share their lived experience and perspectives, but I do think we underestimate kids' abilities to share and know what works good. So I do think it's something we don't do enough, like asking kids what they find works well. Obviously, some might not feel comfortable to share, and that's completely valid, but I think we need to do better giving younger kids these opportunities, because like they know their bodies and their lives, and they're able to share. So I think as adults, we are able to, and we have more years to be able to share and more information. But at the same time, I do think that we don't ask kids enough what works for them.
Thanks, Mac. We might move on. There's a slide in the slide deck around sources of information, and we might come back to that because I'm really keen to keep the conversation going with Mac, Ashley, and Will. So what we might move on to now, if that's all right, is talking about supports. And really keen to hear your insights, Will, on the sorts of adjustments that you have found helpful growing up, and how being included with those adjustments was part of your childhood. Are there things you'd like to share with us on that section, please?
Yeah, so back in the day, I received speech pathology, occupational therapy, physiotherapy, you name it, I got it. That was fun. Basically was told that I wouldn't talk, but hey, I'm talking to you guys now, so prove them wrong. Was told that I wouldn't walk, talk, run, drink. I was told that I wouldn't graduate school, university, you name it. I did all those things. I worked that hard because of these speech pathology and these occupational therapy and physiotherapy. All of these supports got me where I am today. So,
Thanks, Will. And I'll go to Ashley next. So we're focusing on supports. So the things that you found useful to support your access as a child, and yeah, your experiences of those.
Yeah, so I unfortunately did not have a lot of access to supports, but the ones that I did, sorry, I think, sorry, the biggest asset I think to me within environments when I could get that support was having a teacher's aide, really. That was the biggest asset I had within sorry, as a parent, sorry, I've lost my train of thought. I'm having a moment. TAs, yes, TAs. Having that asset was really easy for me to have access within those younger years and all that kind of stuff, because yeah, unfortunately, not a lot of knowledge, and there still isn't around autistic females, so I probably didn't have the supports that I could have really deserved or had.
Thank you, Ashley. Sorry, my mouse is not working as fast as my hand is today. Mac, can I pass to you? So we're talking about supports and advocating for those or adjustments that you might have needed as a young child. And I suppose also, now that you're older, how you use those experiences to advocate for yourself.
Awesome. I think I've had a lot of supports. I honestly had a similar experience to Will, actually. I got told there's no point in putting educational adjustments into me because I was not going to pass high school and I was going to drop out after primary school. And so they said, they practically said there was not worthwhile investing in my education because there was no point. I'm in year 12 this year. I maintain an A average. So like there was effort, but my parents kind of fought against that and made sure I got support. So obviously, I think it's really important that like Will and I, obviously what we got told as a young age isn't true for us, but even if it is, that doesn't mean that kids not deserving of supports and an opportunity to thrive. And even if that thriving looks very, very different from other kids, they're still deserving of that opportunity. Which is why I was saying before, it's about a balance between what medical professionals say and communities, because sometimes medical professionals can say things that are wrong and a little bit hurtful. I've had a lot of different supports throughout my life. Actually, after this, I'm off to physiotherapy. But something I really appreciated about my supports was, and they never took over my life. I do a lot of therapies. I have lots of specialists, so much physio homework, but it doesn't bombard my life. And I was still able to have a childhood, which I really appreciated. And I think when we talk about supports, we always talk about like parents and carers getting supports for each other, which is super duper important. But something I think we don't get talk enough as young kids, connecting young kids with other young kids who get it. I remember in year 8, no more longer a young kid, but this was my first proper experience of it. I had a teacher who also had dyslexia, and that was my first time having someone who got my brain on a different level. And the way we would talk, we would make jokes in class in front of everyone and just normalized it. And it made me feel so much more confident and comfortable. Like I don't see my brain and the way I think as a bad thing. I just see it as a difference because I was able to get supports from people who got my life. And so I think just as important as for parents to be able to talk to other parents, It's the same for kids. Also knowing that like just because you put two kids together with the same diagnosis doesn't mean they're going to get friends, but giving kids that personal opportunity to connect to their communities can be so worthwhile. In regards to adjustments and arrangements, it is a battle. I have dyslexia, but because I have learned how to work with my brain really well, because I got supports at a young age, I do well in school. And so the education system doesn't see me as a dyslexic kid deserving of supports, but I do well in school because I get supports. So it's hard to fight, but it is worthwhile, because if I didn't get all those supports and adjustments done at that time, that doctor would have been right. I would have dropped out of school. And not to lie, there are multiple times I got pretty close to dropping out, but because I had supports, I was able to get through, and I'm graduating this year. So I think it's hard in the moment, and there are so many battles. I know the amount of meetings Mom and I had with the principal and the schools to get stuff done, but at the end of the day, it's really, really rewarding. So I think in regards to that, like, just keep going, and it is hard, and find people to rant to, because there are so many people who get it, but in the end, it's really, really worth it.
I'll get whoever's happy to share to jump in on this question, but it sounds like you're all very aware right now at your age of what's needed in your supports, what's needed in your adjustments. Can you remember, or have you got a sense of when people started asking you directly? And was it your family that, yeah, we'll go?
So I got asked about my supports about halfway through year 10. That's when I got asked about what I wanted to achieve and through my supports. I think it should have been from the get-go of school.
Yep.
For everyone, because yeah.
Yep. Ashley or Mac, what about you? When
So I would have been about the same as Will, maybe year 9, maybe around about that. But I found whenever I got asked what support do I need, I always found it was because the teachers didn't know how to give that support to begin with. So whilst, yes, it is very important to include the child in this support, agreeing, sorry. But there is a big difference between a teacher coming to you because they don't know how to support you, and including a child in the process of developing their support systems. So I think there really needs to kind of be some sort of way to figure out for teachers and education people to have that knowledge of how to support children with disabilities. But yeah, that's kind of my biggest one.
Thanks, Ashley. Mac, I know I'm asking you a loaded question because I know you've talked about this before, but your relationship with your mum and how you've talked about what you need, I'm wondering if you could give some insight into that as to her role in pushing you forward as an advocate for yourself.
Yeah, I think something I really appreciate is I got an opportunity to be involved in conversations about how you can support me and like what supports I need for school. There were multiple times in like IEP meetings, so individual learning plan, where they didn't want me to come, but Mum always made sure I had the opportunity, and I really appreciated that. So I do a lot of advocacy work now. That's how I make a living while I'm studying, and I love it. But because I was set up that way to be able to get supports and get a say, which I really, really appreciate, because most people don't get that. But in that same regard, I don't think it was until year 8 I actually got properly asked, how can I support you directly as an individual? And to be honest, I didn't know what to say, because as a kid, and even now, I'm still learning what works for me, because people ask how you can support me, and that's great. But if that's the first time I've been asked, and even now, I don't know what I'm allowed to ask for. Say, for example, it wasn't until COVID I learned that I really benefit from captions, because someone else had it. And I was like, this is a thing. So I think when we ask about how we can support, like, how can I support you? It's really helpful to also give examples of things that can look like, which is something I wish was given a lot younger, because if you just asked me how to support me when I was younger, I'd have been like, I don't, what, but if you said, hey, do you need this? Can we do this? It would be super helpful. And when things started to get offered to me, I knew from year 7, hey, I actually need to not do a language because I need breaks at school to do work because it takes me longer to do homework. And because people give me those opportunities, I was then to identify it myself at a younger age. So I think it's really helpful to have the open-end question, but also giving like evidence to be like, hey, these are your options too. You can ask for other stuff, but here's what you can ask, is a really important way to frame these questions too. And now I have a whole document for support workers of like organizations and like youth workers, for example, that I give them this whole, it's currently 3 pages, but it's not even halfway done, of how you can support me because I was involved in these conversations at a young age.
Big curly question before we go to a break. Do you think that there is a place for families to start asking their young children, and it might look quite different? So I can imagine, you put your hand out to offer some assistance to a young child, they push your hand away, and they do it themselves. In many ways, that style of, what can I do to help, offering help and listening to their responses. Do you think we can start doing this earlier? I know many of you have said that obviously not early enough when it's school, but if we take it right back to early childhood, what do you think about those smaller ways of finding out what supports children need?
I want to jump in first because we'll kind of add on to what I was going to say in the chat. So I think just kind of add on what Mac talked about. Yes, bringing in a child to an IEP meeting can actually be quite good to help practice their advocating skills and all that kind of stuff. However, IEP meetings aren't always the greatest of environments for many reasons. So I don't want parents to kind of think, oh, I must bring my child to IEP meetings because that's the only way that they will be able to advocate for themselves. That is not true. My mum never brought me to an IEP meeting in my life. I think really there is other ways to kind of start that support, especially in the early childhood years, by just kind of, one thing that I was always very fortunate about was my parents from the get-go just said, you're autistic, so you do X, Y, and Z a little bit differently, and you may also have this, and this. So from a young age, I was lucky to understand my disability a lot more. And I think bringing in things like that from a very early age and explaining to them why they might do this differently or why they might have this physical difference between everyone else will help them be able to go, oh, I need this, or maybe I need that. So yeah, that's kind of the one big thing I wanted to kind of push.
Mac, did you have anything you wanted to add before we zoom off to a break?
I just want to say I completely agree. I'm loving the term curly questions, by the way. I think curly hair, curly questions, I love them. I think 100% we should be trying to do this before school. School environments might not always be the most supportive, so it might actually not give a kid an opportunity to explore, but home environments might be a little bit more of a safer environment for that kid to start exploring. So 100%, I think we definitely should. I think the issue is we don't bring it up long enough that when kids grow up to be adults with disabilities, then they're thrusted into the adult world of advocating, and most of them don't know what to do from there. So I think if we started as early as possible and kind of normalize it, I don't think we normalize these conversations enough, but if we start doing it at that age, we can have some super duper confident 6-year-olds entering prep who know what they need and know what they want. And I mean, that just sounds pretty awesome. So I definitely agree with what you said.
Thank you. There'll be more curly questions to come, trust me. So we're going to take a break now. On my clock, Victoria, New South Wales, or Brisbane time, it's 10:57. So let's come back at 3 minutes past the hour. So in 6 minutes time. So please turn off your camera, turn off your sound, just take a break, stay with us, and we'll be back soon. Thank you. We might make a start because we've got a little bit more that we want to cover. So we're going to move on to funding. Now, as I promised before, we're not going to go through the ins and outs of the NDIS, but Ashley, I might start with you if that's all right. Sorry that you've got a mouthful. Talking about funding, so the types of funding that you had access to, and I suppose using it effectively, and any lessons that you wanted to share about that, please.
Sure. So I had no, as previously stated, I had no funding outside of my school funding. So I will kind of only really talk about that because that's the only experience I really have. So I think my biggest thing is, from a parent's point of view, I think is just to kind of listen out to others as to what is working for their child that may have a similar disability, as that could potentially work for your child. Because unfortunately, a lot of these systems, they won't tell you what you can actually do with this money and support and all that kind of stuff. So I really think the biggest thing in order to get the best out of funding, or one of the biggest things is to kind of listen to others who have gone through, whether that's parents who have children of a similar age, or if that's someone like me who has lived experience of the disability, and listen to what worked for them, what didn't work for them, all that kind of stuff, to kind of get the best out of your child's funding. So that's a way to approach it. Another thing I kind of want to, I am aware this is kind of changing, but I know this is still somewhat around, is to reiterate what I talked about before, was to, if you think your child has a comorbidity, please look into it, because that does come with funding and potentially even more support services. So for example, something else I got diagnosed with when I was 15, but this is still really relevant to my story, is dyspraxia. So for anyone who's not necessarily aware of dyspraxia, the easiest way to explain it is it's essentially a fine motor version of dyslexia. And so how my dyspraxia affected me was my handwriting. As I mentioned before, I had poor handwriting, all that kind of stuff. For many, many, many moons and years, my mum would push for a laptop, especially in high school years, for me to take notes and all that kind of stuff to use. But the support services always knocked that back, because the argument was, well, she could just have terrible handwriting. But then once I got the diagnosis of dyspraxia, we could kind of go, well, no, it's not just terrible handwriting. She actually has a disability that is causing her to have issues within this area. She needs that support. And lo and behold, we got the support. So I think they're kind of my two biggest things I would like people to take away, is reaching out to others, and again, reiterating, if you think your child has something, look into it.
Thank you, Ashley. That's really helpful. Will, funding we were talking about. So just whether you had any insights you wanted to share on using it effectively, or lessons from your experience, please.
What was that, Sue, again? Sorry, my sister interrupted me.
That's okay. Around funding and what sort of experiences you've had, and I suppose what we can learn from your experiences with navigating funding.
Okay, so from the get-go of starting school and preschool, I had a teacher's aide, or a TA. 20 hours was the allocated time of support. So That was really good. Well, I had an IEP, so individual educational plan, guys. If you do not know what acronyms are, that's fine. What else? I had a very good IEP. I had integration with the local primary school as well. That was fun. I did drama. I did cooking, music, choir, you name it, I did it all. Yeah.
Sounds like you were quite busy, Will. What did those experiences help you with? What did those experiences mean to you?
Ooh, okay. It meant that I could teach people about my disability in a fun, creative way. There was other people with a disability there. I wasn't the only one, and yeah. So
Thank you. Okay, Mac, can I throw to you? So we're talking about funding, and I suppose navigating that space and reflecting on what worked for you, and what lessons you'd share around that, please.
So growing up, my disabilities never met like the criteria to be able to access funding. But as I've gotten older, I've collected a few more additional diagnoses, and finally reached the point in which I would be eligible for the NDIS. And we applied a few years ago. We got denied. It was more of a logistic thing with reports, and we're in the process of reapplying now. So very, very close. We're up to the last letter. So I can't speak from past experiences, but I can speak on what I've found currently helpful. Firstly, navigating funding. Oh my gosh, it's a lot. I have found a few things really helpful. Partly, I started the application when I was under 18, so it was mum. Now I'm 18, so technically it's more on me. But having a bit more of a collaborative role with it was really helpful. Mum allowed me to be involved with it, but it's really overwhelming, to be honest. And so it was also really helpful to be like, actually, Mum, this part I can't. You have to take over. But other parts being like, actually, I want to write the email, or I want to have the phone call, or getting that opportunity to be involved and start to understand things has been really helpful, but no pressure and able to back off because funding is a lot to access. Something else I found really helpful is talking to community. I think that's probably always my biggest advice, but especially with funding because it can be so diagnosis specific. So for mine, for example, it is much harder to access supports because the way it presents in two people can fluctuate so very differently, and each day can look very different for my condition, which means it's very hard to get that stability that is often needed for funding. And so we have talked to lots of people who are on the NDIS with my diagnosis about how do we need to get letters and how do we need to have these conversations, and what works has been so helpful because medical professionals don't have that information. The NDIS doesn't have that information, but people who've been there have it. And I think something else that's been really helpful for us is at moments it's okay to take a break. You're working towards it and it is a process. And so as long as you're continually working towards it, that's okay. And it's okay if it gets overwhelming and you need a break. We got defeated after the first round of denial and we took a few months off just to breathe and get ready for the next round because it's a lot of advocating. Something else, finding people to rant to has been really helpful as well, to talk about the process and the system and let out all of that frustration that you are having. It shouldn't be this difficult to access funding, but the reality is for most people, it is. So yeah, that's what I have found helpful. And if you're also on the journey from funding, I see you, I hear you, I am with you with it. And hopefully we'll get through this, but just kind of sticking together is probably my key advice.
Thank you, Mac, and thank you everybody for Ashley and Will as well for sharing those experiences and those insights. I'm going to ask Daniel now to pull up slide 21, because I think there's a key theme here out of all of these conversations. And that is around the role of advocacy. And I suppose, Mac, I'll ask you this question. What we want to give insight to is how linking the supports, the adjustments, and the needs of you as an individual person to the funding. So not funding for funding's sake, but I was wondering if you could share, what will you do with the funding that you would get under the NDIS? How will that enable things like supports and adjustments? Because often people talk about, this person's getting X thousands of dollars, but is it really in how you spend that money that's that you're looking forward to?
Oh yeah, I have a list. It's actually right next to me. I bullet journal. It is my pride and joy, and I love it. And in there, I have a list of my plan of what I want when I get my NDIS. I'm a wheelchair user 90% of the time. I have a degree of mobility, which involves stumbling and holding onto walls for dear life. So not really, I'm mostly a wheelchair user, but my chair is from eBay. Is a $50 secondhand eBay chair that is made for aged care centers and not for like self-propelling wheelchairs. So I am planning on getting a proper wheelchair, as well as getting support worker hours. Like I'm an adult, but my mom still has to take me places, which is okay, but I would like to start getting a bit more independent. So support worker hours. I have a form of AFOs, which are ankle foot orthotics, but they aren't the ones I need. So currently my list is a bunch of medical equipment and devices that we just can't afford, but is going to improve my quality of life so very much. Of course, actually not having to pay for my own therapies, because I have a lot. So, but I think for me, the big stuff is all of those equipment and devices that is going to give me so much more independence and autonomy and ease in life is what I'm so very much so looking forward to.
So what I can hear is mobility and getting out in your community safely, and one that supports your well-being. I can hear you getting out there and I suppose, demonstrating and using your independence from your mother because of the age that you're at and the decisions you want to make. So that physical use of support workers. And I hear obviously health and well-being around having a set of AFOs that support you for longer term gains as well around therapies and things like that. So I suppose similar goals to what people might have for younger children: mobility, well-being, inclusion, those sorts of things. So the slide we've got up at the moment, conscious of where we're heading towards our finish time shortly, and I want to leave space for questions from any of the attendees, but just to re-emphasize the role of advocacy, and we've talked about this a little bit today, just around supporting children to find their own voice, giving them opportunities to practice that as early as possible in their childhood. And again, obviously Mac and Ashley reflected on different levels of involvement in meetings with their school. So, picking the time and place that is appropriate for the child that we're talking about to practice their advocacy themselves, what suits their situation. And then the other element is thinking about families as advocates. So making sure that the child is front and center in that advocacy process. And as you navigate through different funding sources, it'll become very clear from the paperwork that you're needing to talk about, the child with the disability or the child with the need for an adjustment or a support. And sometimes there can be a tendency for the family to talk about their needs, but so many of the funding models these days are driven around making sure that the child's needs are front and center. Families being able to prepare and practice and being clear and patient in that process. We also wanted to flag the role of professional advocates who are meant to support or work on you or your child's behalf, helping you to speak out and defending rights and interests. So there's a couple of links there as well. People with Disability Australia has a great resource around self-advocacy, and also DANA, or Disability Advocacy Network Australia. They have some great resources to get started on how to advocate. I think as we've already reflected on, very rarely do people tell you how to access the funding or what they will fund. So having that access to other people who've been through similar processes or who are able to provide professional insight to the process as well. And I suppose to value the lived experience of people with disability themselves, because they have danced through this process their whole lives and often have great lessons to share. So there aren't any questions raised in the chat, but I suppose whether Daniel or Ewan or anyone else from the chat now had any questions. So we'll move on to Q&A. Whether there is anything specific around or general around information, supports or funding that you wanted to ask Mac, Will or Ashley, please. Keen to take any questions at this point. Okay, so I'm not seeing anything in the chat. Daniel or Ewan, did you want to throw any curly questions at our team today?
Sorry, Sue, nothing pops to mind right now.
Thanks, Ewan.
Daniel speaking. I'm happy to throw out a curly question. And sorry if this is content that's already been covered before. So I know that a lot of parents and carers are in attendance today to gain some insights into ways that they can support the inclusion and the engagement in early childhood spaces. What I was wondering is, what is some advice that you would give specifically to those young people, those 3 to 6, 7, 8-year-olds who are going through that process? What are some key pieces of advice that you'd give to them that carers and stuff can pass on to their young ones about this whole process and being resilient in space?
Ashley, can I throw that one to you first?
Sure, that definitely is a tricky one. I guess it's kind of a hard thing to comment on, because at the end of the day, we try to educate people and we try to support people, but as someone who works in education, I am aware that sometimes it's just not going to happen for whatever reason. I think the biggest thing that I think parents and caregivers should take away from it is installing in your child quickly, and this is probably more around kind of 6 to 8 years old. I can't really see a 3-year-old having the ability to do this, but some 3-year-old might, is to just be able to explain to them that they have a right to speak up if something's not going right within their education and you're not around, whether that's flat out saying to the teacher, why aren't you following this on my ILP, or just letting them have the ability to ask questions around things like, but I need this, why isn't this here? Or just things like that, I think could go a really long way. Again, I am aware that younger kids within early childhood probably wouldn't have that ability to vocalize that. And I think really for the younger kids, I think the best thing, as someone who works, the youngest I've worked with is about 3 years old, so is to just kind of check in with your child's room leader, teacher, whatever your early childhood setting is for your child, just to make sure that everything is going okay, even implementing things like diaries. So one thing that I have seen with younger years is implementing diaries. So because as a lot of these parents would know, it's very hard to actually get a conversation out of your teacher sometimes as to how your child is going through a day-to-day process. So one thing that could be potentially beneficial is implementing a diary that the teacher could potentially, or TA or whatever, could kind of write some notes about how your child is going, and then so then you have an ability to understand if they are following these certain needs, and if they're not, then maybe that warrants you to go and have a nice conversation with them around what's going on and how to support your child. So yeah.
Will or Mac, did you have any insights you wanted to share to Daniel's question about, for the younger years, your suggestions for families and caregivers?
I'm happy to jump in. I was thinking about this question. I love it. I think there's a few things. Something I really appreciated is that my parents talked to me about my disabilities at a young age. Obviously, we didn't use the word disability then, and we didn't always use the diagnosis, because obviously at a young age, you might not have the diagnosis straight away. They just might be symptoms or traits, and not yet a label. But we talked about it like, you're not dumb, you just struggle to reading because your brain's wired a bit differently, or having those conversations, and then also talking about, yeah, because your brain's wired a bit differently, it means you're a lot more creative and out the box thinking. So that's been really helpful for me. I talk about my disability a lot. I get that's my job. My job is to talk about being disabled, and I love it. But because I had those conversations at a young age, I was able to. And obviously that looks different for each kid, so leading in what the kid wants to talk about, but like, don't be afraid to have those conversations, because if we're afraid to talk about it, it can send messages to our kids that this is something they shouldn't be talking about and it's not okay to talk about. So it's really important that we normalize it. Something else that I think is really important when we talk about, like, specifically for today's webinar about like funding and supports and information, is letting your kids know that their supports they need aren't special or different or asking too much. That's just their needs, and that's okay. And they're allowed to get it met, which is something that I am still working through, knowing that just because I have more needs than others isn't a bad thing. It doesn't make me too much or a burden. They're just my needs, and I'm deserving to get them met. And I think it's really helpful that we like instill this in like young kids so they grow up not feeling that way. And then that means when they enter education, they are better equipped to be able to get their needs met and say, hey, this isn't this, you're doing this not the way it's supposed to be done. This is how you're supposed to support me, or this is what is supposed to be done, because they know it's okay and that their needs are not too much. And I think that's something that I wish we do better with the next generation.
That's great. Absolutely, Mike. And Will, did you have any comments that you wanted to share about the things you want families of young children to know to support their child?
Yeah, as someone that's been a teacher's aide for about 2 years now, I've left the profession to take up a break because I really needed a break. So I implemented communication diaries for all of students. So that entailed what Ashley said about the TA and the teacher writing in what the student needed or all of that. So for an example, if the student was upset, I would say, Joe Blow was upset today. I've consulted the wellbeing team, da 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 da. So that was real. That's where I left there for them. What tips can I give parents? Oh, that's a hard one. I'm not a parent. I'm an uncle, but I guess I can use that as an advantage. Support your child the way through, like my parents did. No day is the same. As I have learnt as being a teacher's aide. And just be there for your child and support your child the way through. Like, I was told that I would never be independent, and I've got some exciting news. I will be moving out of my parents' home in 2023. So, yeah. I'm so happy.
That's very exciting news, Will. I'm conscious of the time, so apologies. We're going to wrap it up. Daniel, if I can get you to go down to slide 26 for me. And I suppose it's just to say that one further for me, please. It is always our privilege to hear directly from young people. Mac, Ashley, Will, thank you very much for your input today on the topic. There's obviously lots that we could cover, which we haven't. So apologies if there was something missing from what you expected. Please access further supports on the CYDA website, or if you have found anything distressing today, please also jump into those supports that we mentioned before. So just to wrap up, there are 2 further topics in our webinar series. The next one will be talking about the slightly controversial topic of school ready. And what does that actually mean? Who needs to be ready for school? And then our final session in October will be around some of the bigger picture examples. So just to say, finally, thank you to all who have joined us today. Thank you for being part of this CYDA session, and obviously big thanks to Mac, Ashley and Will for sharing parts of their experience. So I'll get our panelists to hang on, but everybody else, thank you very much for joining us today, and we'll see you soon.